Välkommen till WellbChannel. Idag kommer vi få celebert besök av Tracy Sinclair som kommer från ICF globalt, och jag kommer berätta lite mer om henne och prata med henne om den ökade intresset för välmående i världen och hur välmående coaching kan hjälpa individer som är nära gränsen till att hamna i psykisk ohälsa. I'm turning to Tracy. Hello, welcome.
Hello, Peter.
It's good to see you again. And Tracy, just an introduction to our viewers here. You are the vice chair and past chair of ICF Global Board, and you are also a coaching specialist, which means you cover the whole spectrum of coaching, of training, of coaching yourself, of speaking, and so on. How did you get there? Just a starting question.
Well, in a very long story short, I've been involved in leadership development for probably the last 25 years. And that's running my own consultancy and training business in that field. And when I returned from maternity leave, having had my children, I wanted to refresh my skills and came across coach training. And it probably transformed my life actually, but particularly transformed my business. And I very rapidly moved all of my business from being a broad spectrum leadership development organization to specifically being very coach specific. And the rest is history. So that was 15 years ago.
Yeah. And you and we met on Iceland about 1.5 years ago, and we connected. And after that, I think it was this spring, we talked about, as you say, spectrum, where a person is in his or her well-being. It differs from everything is great to it's really tough out there. And in that call, you talked about something you referred to as the gray space, the area where a person is in between real well-being and the risk of ending up in bad health. How can you describe that zone? What is happening, or what can we notice with a person who is in that space?
It's a great question. And I think really what first alerted me to noticing what I call this grey space is two personal experiences actually. And that is, one was that I several years ago trained as a counsellor, and I specialised in addiction counselling for drug and alcohol addicts who were most often very much, below that health line and that well-being line, if you like. But also, my husband has struggled also with mental health challenges over the last few years, and I have noticed just how if you like, the general infrastructure isn't necessarily always there to help people avoid getting into a really, really difficult place. Yeah. And so for me, the grey space, as I call it, is that grey area, that no man's land almost, between the spectrum of, on the one hand, what is very clearly a therapeutic setting, and on the other hand, what is very clearly a coach setting. And when you get closer to what I call the well-being line, there's a grey space hovering just on either side, where it could be a case for coaching, it could be a case for therapy. And how do we as practitioners navigate that and notice it?
Exactly. So there will be some signs, I guess, from the clients we meet, which will make us think this person is closing to that line. What could that be? What could we be witnessing?
Well, we're all unique and different, aren't we? And so in each particular case, it could be a very slightly different thing that's noticed. However, what I would say is that there are certain characteristics, if you like, that start to flag up that someone is perhaps not coping with life or their role or whatever it might be quite so well. And they are characteristics or signals, if you like, such as things like mood swings, procrastination and struggling to make choices and decisions, perhaps as a leader. Perhaps one's mood is a little bit more volatile. Perhaps the person maybe is starting to feel more irritability or more hesitation, more uncertainty, more fear even around their role. And then there are other very physiological signs that could also be coming in, like things such as trouble with sleeping, changes in eating habits, changes in drinking habits, and general energy and sense of engagement and how in control someone feels. And so what often we're looking for is not necessarily just one ad hoc change in those things, because of course our moods and our well-being fluctuates anyway. We're not always at a state of euphoria, are we? So, happiness in itself and well-being is also a transient state. And so the simple fact that someone is struggling to sleep sometimes is not necessarily an indication of a mental health challenge. But if that is a sustained pattern that's different from the norm, and we also start to see that clustered with perhaps one or two other of these characteristics, then when we look at that as a holistic picture, it starts to perhaps give us some information or an indication that perhaps we're not really coping with things as well as we might do.
And I think maybe you see what I see also, that it's hard especially for leaders to talk about these more, let's call it softer things, that is happening. They are more interested in talking about career, about critical issues at business or something like that. I find it hard sometimes to get that discussion on the table, so to speak, about how can we as coaches sort of go bypass what they want to talk about and find the real issues, because we sometimes notice it. And we notice it by the way they're acting, or their acting doesn't meet with what they're saying and so on. So what could be ways around what they are showing to find these issues that you're talking about?
Yes, I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think, again, this does depend on the organisational culture. So given the more openness that we're starting to get around this subject of well-being and mental health, some organisations do find themselves, I think, now having greater access to the vocabulary and feeling more open to have those conversations. However, as you quite rightly say, there are still many organisations and many cultures and many leaders, therefore, who struggle to actually overtly engage in how they're feeling about things. And so I think there's something really, part of the general competence of a coach and a coaching approach anyway, is that part of our lexicon is to explore how someone is feeling about something as well as how they are thinking about it.
Exactly.
So already as we engage in a coaching process, we are inviting in that space of exploring feelings, not necessarily feelings associated with well-being, but feelings generally.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Now I'm thinking also, so we can see, we understand what kind of tools we can use. So I was thinking also that there's a small picture where the individual is. And as you say, there's more openness also within companies to talk about this. We also notice in media, social media, traditional media, we notice in organizations like the World Health Organization, like UN, they talk about, corporate social responsibility. They talk about environment, social and governance. But I don't see very often talks about how do we make an individual sustainable? We talk about products and procedures, and we talk about, the outer environment, but we don't talk about individual sustainability. What's your comment on that?
Yes, I mean, this may be a very cynical perspective, I'm not sure, but in line with what you were just sharing there, I do think that in many settings, in an organisational setting, particularly in the private sector, ultimately the focus is quite often for the organisation on organisational success rather than necessarily the success of the people that make up that organisation. And historically, we have seen in an organisational context how the focus on people as a core resource is often at the bottom of the list. I know from many years ago when I was in the corporate field in financial services, when we were looking at major change initiatives, for example, we looked at technical systems first, then policies and procedures, and people at the bottom. And unfortunately, that hierarchy can often still exist, especially when we are in, ever more so, a technically driven world. So I do still think that there is a lot of work that needs to be done at the leadership and cultural level within organisations to really not just say that our people are important, but really act as though they are important. Because ultimately, the human resource, the human capital is critical to the success of an organisation in most cases.
It is, and it's also one of the costlier part of an organization, actually. And what we notice now in media is that there's a bigger focus on well-being. People start to understand we can't have people falling out because of stress or bad sleep or unhealthy issues. Those are increasing immensely, and we don't have support from traditional caretaking. It's not enough. So we see that coaching has a piece of this space here, I think. And I think we need to be there for the organizations that want to see to that we're too late. We need to start earlier, and I think coaching is one way of being there for them without people feeling that they're ill, but be on a supporter to people being in that space. I was thinking if we go into a bit more to talk about what we call well-being coaching, do you see that as a separate part of coaching, or is it something else we do that we don't do in individual coaching? Talk about well-being coaching.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. On the one hand, one could say that well-being coaching is just another context for how we offer coaching generally. For example, corporate coaching, charitable coaching, coaching with for-profit organisations or non-for-profit, some coaches that specialise in things like leadership coaching, or people who specialise in fitness coaching. So there is an argument to say that well-being coaching is no more than a context for the coaching work to be done. And to a point, I do subscribe to that perspective, because I do firmly believe that if an individual is very well trained as a coach and they are applying the skill set and the discipline of good coaching competence and good coaching practice, then we ought to be able to work in a very wide variety of settings and contexts. And even to the point where sometimes we may feel in coaching that the more we know about the situation and the person, the more that knowledge can actually get in the way. So there is also a school of thought within coaching that the less we know, the better, because we have a much cleaner perspective. However, on the other hand, I do think that some level of awareness of well-being, mental health, not to the point of where coaches need to be trained counsellors, therapists or psychologists necessarily, but some kind of toolkit and signposting so that coaches can navigate this grey space. Because the thing I'm noticing is that some coaches will have almost like a pendulum swing reaction, in that when faced with a situation around a potential well-being or mental health challenge, some coaches, because of their concern for ethical practice and offering what's appropriate, may very quickly back away from a piece of coaching work that could actually be incredibly valuable if only they felt a little bit more confident and equipped to do that work. Right. However, at the other end of the spectrum, what we also have to take care of is that coaches aren't stepping into that space too deeply and getting almost, out above their heads, if you like, because the work actually really needs a therapeutic setting. So I think it's the guidance and the navigation of that space that's really important.
Very good. And so what I'm trying to summarize here is that some part of experience and maturity in coaching comes in play here, not only your training. Maybe you have been, in a situation yourself in that space. Will that come handy? Will that be useful? The maturity and maybe have experienced something like being in that space.
I definitely think that experience and personal maturity, and by maturity I mean emotional maturity, rather than age as such. But really, someone who is self-aware and therefore can engage more effectively with someone in that space. But also, there are, for example, some coaches who will really back away from that and feel very unconfident in that space. And so I do think that, something like well-being guidelines, mental health guidelines are very useful for a coach's general background knowledge and awareness. For example, in the UK, and I'm sure in other places, mental health first aid training is now something that's becoming very popular, which could be a very useful resource to coaches and other practitioners in these kinds of settings.
That's right. We see it here as well. You mentioned not stepping over the ethical code limits. What could be signals that we as coaches should look for to not move into that sort of therapeutic part? What are we looking for here? What can give us those signals?
Well, there's one very obvious one, which thankfully doesn't seem to happen too often, and that is that from our code of ethics perspective, if we have any sense at all that our client is at risk of harming themselves or others, then that is an immediate red flag for us to signal with them that we need to have a conversation perhaps about a different kind of service that would be most helpful to them. However, it can take quite a while for someone's mental health or well-being to decline before they get to that space. And that's I suppose, really where we're wanting to make a difference. And so I think it really is, if someone is really showing some of these characteristics that I described earlier, and of course there are several others, that in a way that really is starting to impede them from taking consistent, sustainable forward steps. And that's one of the core elements, I think, that can differentiate coaching from therapy. And that is that coaching, in essence, is a forward-moving, aspirational, achievement-focused way of working, if you like. And so if a person is, because of how they are feeling, unable to set goals, to take steps towards those goals, and able to actually have any kind of forward movement, then that would start to show up a little bit of a red flag for me. And really, I think what's important is that coaches somehow need to have some kind of a support resource. And I think, not wanting to sort of open up the conversation too much in this area, but coaching supervision, for example, is something that can be very, very valuable to a coach who perhaps is faced with a situation that they are uncertain of. And I think really the rule of thumb for me would be, if in doubt, ask. Yeah. Don't struggle alone, uncertain and burdened and conflicted around what to do, but have a conversation with a coaching supervisor or with a confidential peer group or other sources of support and resource that are available.
Yeah, and I think, as coaches, we also need to be well, right? So we're sort of not infected, but we are touched by what's happening with our clients sometimes. And we want to have our own well-being, and we also want to be sustainable as coaches. And speaking of sustainability, how would you support a client outside of the coaching? What would be helpful support activities or tools to see that sustainability comes in play here, so that the client really moves on, even without the coaching?
Yes, definitely. One of the things that I've worked on with clients, which I actually learned through the experiences that my husband had in his health challenges, was to actually create something along the lines of a well-being plan, which again is something that could be quite unique to each individual. But in essence, it's really perhaps working with the client so that they have almost this well-being plan as an output from the coaching engagement. And the well-being plan can cover things such as, what does well-being mean for me? What is it that I experience and notice that tells me that my well-being is within the parameters of how I want it to be? What are the sustaining practices that I know work for me that help underpin my well-being? And having, a very clear practical plan around how to implement those activities. And then lastly, what would I be noticing that would be a signal to me that my well-being was starting to slide to a place where I maybe needed to have a little bit more attention on it. So in essence, I think there's something very practical that can come out of a package of well-being coaching, if that's what we want to call it, that could be a very useful resource to people that they co-create with their coach, and is something they're taking out of the piece of work.
Yeah, thank you. What I hear also, or what we read and what I hear from you, is that there is quite a huge space and need for coaches here to work with well-being of people. So together with you, we're inviting you. Sorry, not together. We're not inviting, but we are inviting you to come to Stockholm on the 10th of October to speak to and meet with coaches who are curious and interested about well-being coaching. So you're most welcome there to speak more about this. And anything you want to add to this conversation at this time, Tracy, that could be interesting for coaches to hear?
Well, other than to thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about this, it's clearly a really important space. And, in some ways it's unfortunate that this opportunity is here, because it means that the mental health and the well-being of many leaders and many teams and communities is challenged. However, it is an opportunity, I believe, for coaching to support people in a very coaching setting before a well-being issue becomes a mental health issue. So there is an enormous opportunity for coaches to add great value, to make a very important contribution to individuals, to teams, to leaders, to organisations, to really underpin the well-being of those individuals, teams and organisations. And I think, one of the big challenges that we have as we come out of a pandemic that's been so impactful in so many ways is we really do need almost an all hands on deck kind of approach to get the economies and the organisations back up and running. And so people's well-being is absolutely critical for that.
It is, and it's a great opportunity for coaches to be a part of that support. Well, thank you so much, Tracy. It's a pleasure, as always, speaking to you, and there's a lot of learning. And I want to thank you for this call and welcome you again to Stockholm. And we'll speak soon, and I'm going to go back to our viewers and try to get them there. Okay.
Right. Thank
you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Ja, tack ni som har tittat på det här samtalet med Tracy Sinclair. Ni är också hemskt välkomna till vår coachingkonferens om WellBeing coaching eller välmående coaching som vi håller på Fotografiska i Stockholm den 10 oktober. Mer om det här kommer vi berätta i nästa avsnitt av WellbChannel. Tack för att du tittade.